I'd like to thank IFPRI for inviting me to give this chance. I'm going to be the outlier. I don't have a PowerPoint, and I'm just going to speak. I was asked perhaps to maybe just start by reflecting a little bit on the precursors to Beijing plus 20. I was a very young woman then. I feel like I'm really old at this point in time, but I was in Copenhagen in 1980 when I was especially young. I was still actually a college student, and then I was in Nairobi in 1985. I actually think that the Nairobi Conference did lay the groundwork for Beijing in 1995, and it was a really important conference because it was really, I think, one of the first times that first of all, there was the expression of voices from women in the third world in the international policy fora on this issue, where it had previously been dominated by women from the northern countries. And it was really one of the first times that there was an articulation, particularly through the group Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, dawn of the global economic context and the effect of crises in food, fuel, and debt on women versus men. And that was a really important critique that has carried through. And I was really pleased to see that in 1995, when the Beijing Platform for Action was approved by consensus by all of the governments that were there, it actually had taken up many of the issues that women, particularly from the Global South, had articulated in the previous 20 years. But that is just a bit of context. What I wanted to actually do now is talk about the influence of IFPRI and how, from my perspective, it's both influenced me, but also the work that I've been doing in and out of academic institutions. And I want to focus my remarks particularly on data and measurement, because I can't understate the importance of this. Data and measurement underlies good, what we hope that data and measurement underlies good policy. We like to talk about evidence-based policy, but we need to do more on the data and measurement front, particularly in key areas of policy. And I'm going to talk about the influence and work going beyond headship to work within households. I want to talk about poverty measurement, and I want to conclude with empowerment. And I have to say, I was also going to mention, so I'm so happy that you did, Mark, this issue of zombie facts, which is, while we have more data and better measurement now, we still have too many zombie facts that have captured the imagination of people. And I feel like one of my roles as an evangelical in institutions is to begin to correct the zombie facts. So I joined AID as their senior gender advisor from 2011 to 2013, and one of the first things I did was to try to take off the website the idea that 70% of the women's poor are women. I was appalled, particularly given that AID had funded Agnes's work back in 1995, the first paper that actually shows that this is completely implausible. So let me talk a little bit about headship. Actually, I was reminding Agnes before coming that that they started this work, but I was fortunate to be involved back in 1991. There was a very influential project that was led by ICRW with the World Bank, with IFPRI, to go within the household to understand that the household is not a black box, but there are males and females within households that bargain over the allocation for sources. And the work that Agnes and her colleagues, Lawrence Haddad and many others, did led to in some quarters, the shifting of the paradigm from the unitary model of the household to the cooperative or collective model of the household. And there was a paper by Ravi Kanbar and I think Lawrence a few years ago that said at this point the burden of evidence is such that, or the body of evidence is such that it's time to shift the burden of proof. And I wish it were the case. I was in Lima last week for the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings, and I actually had somebody call me up when I was talking about why it's so important to go within the household, say to me, but Gary Becker, back in, I said, oh my God, you are really out of date. This was written in 1976. There's been a huge body of evidence since that time. I think we actually have shifted the burden of proof, at least in people's mindsets. But one area where it hasn't actually taken hold is in the collection of data and measurement. And so that's what I want to actually talk about. Because I think until we can crack that nut, of data collection and measurement, we won't actually have shifted the burden of proof. So I want to talk about this in giving two examples. One is in the area of taxation, and one is then on the area of assets, which Agnes had also touched on. Back a few years ago, in 2007, Hitomi Komatsu, who's here with me, started a project. It was a 7-country study looking at how gender biases may be embedded in tax policies and how tax reforms may unintentionally or even in some cases intentionally reinforce gender biases. But when we started this project, we realized immediately that consumption and expenditure data is based on the household. And we didn't have very little, and when you think about what would be the biases in a tax policy, you have to look at individuals. And of course, headship is a very unsatisfactory way, as Agnes and her colleagues have demonstrated. Headship is a very unsatisfactory way to look at households. So on the other hand, we don't have a lot of the within household information in terms of income and consumption. So how do you get around that? So we developed a novel method to try to identify using demographic information, information that's collected in the demographic roster of most household surveys or even consumption and expenditure surveys, ways to categorize households by whether they are a female type or a male type. And you can do this using the information that does exist in household surveys on employment or on income, who earns, and we developed different typologies. So one of the most important things that I think was demonstrated by IFPRI is that it's important to go beyond headship, but when you're stuck with data where you have it at the household level, the default is going back to headship. So I think one area that we have to continue to push as a research community is moving to a richer, at least, typology of households, even if we have household level data, to household types as opposed to male-headed households or female-headed households. And I'm one of my bugaboos about this. I really hate the concept of headship. Not only is it sexist, but for comparative work, when you actually dig into definitions of who is considered a head in countries around the world, you find very different definitions. So in some studies, the head is the person who is the eldest. In some surveys, the head is the person who's the quote-unquote principal decision maker, as if there could ever be, if you've ever lived in a household, as if there could ever be one person who is Gary Becker's altruistic dictator who is making all decisions within a household, and particularly of households with kids, when you know that kids often determine what the decision is as opposed to a quote-unquote head. Or in some cases, it was the principal breadwinner. So what you have to look really carefully about this definition of household head, because sometimes you might be comparing a giraffe with an orange, which is obviously not the appropriate comparator. So I think that there's work to be done there. But the more important thing is to actually go get surveys to start going to collect within household information. And this is an area that is still very much an uphill battle and challenge. When I joined AID in 2011, so let me actually back up and come to that in 1 minute. Getting people to think about the within household data collection, you encounter a lot of arguments and a lot of resistance. Partly based on IFPRI's work, but also because of the work on tax and other things. I also had the privilege of working on the UN Millennium Project in 2005, and we had proposed some indicators for what was then MDG 3, which was limited rather narrowly to education and had a very narrow set of indicators. And we wanted to go to individual level indicators based on assets, based on income, employment, and so forth. And at the time, and unfortunately it's still true today, you have people who push back to say we can't get the individual level information within households. It's too expensive, number one. Number two, we don't know what the right questions are. It's too hard to collect, and countries don't want it and won't use it. And so I'm going to give my punchline, what I was going to say in a few minutes. We actually have to, I think, have a better job of the evidence of the cost effectiveness of data collection, what it really does, of means of answering the questions individually within households, and showing the demand by countries for this type of data. I was knocking on the door. We got in 2005 a set of individual level indicators into the MDGs, but nothing actually ever happened with these great indicators. So like women's share of land ownership, for instance. And we didn't get any traction on this because the data was not being collected. So you can't have indicators unless you have underlying data collection. And in 2000, a group of colleagues, Carmen Diana Deer, Cheryl Doss, who's now with you, and I went to the World Bank and asked the International Household Survey Network to begin collecting individual level information within households. They said no. And we decided to go out and raise money, and we started something called the Gender Asset Gap Project, which, working very cooperatively with IFPRI, collected within household information from a principal male and a principal female on all forms of physical and financial assets, asking a lot of questions about perception of ownership in terms of a legal document or a title deed, and the transaction rights, which is another measure of ownership. And we did this in Ecuador and Ghana at the national level and at the state level in Karnataka, India. And ever since that time, a group of us have been meeting quite frequently to talk about what we've learned from the collection of intra-household information on asset ownership. This experience with this project was so important for me. When I got to AID, I actually worked with AID to do two things. The first was to actually, the Feed the Future project, which many of you know and which Agnes referred to, actually has population-based studies in 19 countries. And we actually moved away from the issue of headship. And we asked them to collect data, if not from at least two people within households, to begin to use a different typology of different kinds of household types. So all population-based surveys now actually collect information and categorize it according to household types based on actually the earning status of members in households. The second thing that we did, as Agnes mentioned, is to create the WIA, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, to actually get real information as opposed to proxy information on outcomes. And I think that's been really important, but we're not there yet in terms of where we have it. As part of the work on the WIA, I'm now at the World Bank, have been really knocking on the doors and trying to use all my influence to actually get the WIA incorporated in the type of household surveys that the World Bank has under its control, so the Living Standards of Measurement Study surveys. And 5 years later, I think we're finally going to do this in Malawi at the national level, but it's been really slow. So I have more hope for a project-level WIA where NGOs and others have more control over it to begin to collect it here. But I think if we don't have measures in national surveys that governments own themselves, we actually won't get the traction that we need. That's enough on headship and assets. I want to say 2 words about poverty. Agnes wrote a really important, very influential paper back in 1995. It was a meta-level analysis of what we know about the gender dimensions of poverty. And of course, it should be quite obvious to people that males and females may be poor for very different reasons. They experience poverty very differently, and they have different abilities to cope and to exit from poverty. But we've had much less success on the measurement front in terms of getting an individual level measurement area. And this, I think, is one of the frontier areas of the future. There's been a lot of progress in the global community at moving away from income-based measures of poverty to multidimensional measures. But we're not at the point of understanding the individual measure as opposed to the household measure. So this is where we need to do, beyond the pioneering work that IFPRI has done on measuring empowerment, going within the household black box. The next frontier is to go back to this agenda, and it's really challenging methodologically to get an individual, multidimensional measure of poverty and to figure out how we use it. So the last thing I think I want to say in closing is, as we do this, we still have work to do on the measurement front to that is going to be important for policy making and evidence. And the first is to demonstrate, again, the cost effectiveness of doing surveys that collect data at the individual level. So this is where IFPRI, I think, does have a comparative advantage, and I think that you could really help the global community by starting to summarize from the range of work that you all have done in different country contexts what you've learned on the costs front. The second is on the methodological front. You know, how you can collect surveys that are not just cost effective, but what have we learned in terms of things like simple things. Do you send out 2 enumerators at a time? You know, issues of sequencing. How do we do this? The world community needs this, and the data collection agencies need this. So I would ask IFPRI to think about this as part of the next stage of where you go. And then finally, the last thing I want to say is until we get to this challenge of individual level data, whether it's ownership and control of assets, whether it's on empowerment, whether it's on the experience of poverty, I personally don't think that we're going to be able to convince policymakers how much it matters. Because when you don't have the individual level information, people can still come back at you, as they are doing, to find the excuses for why it doesn't matter. And I think the great examples that you've presented, for instance, in social protection, are partial victories. But there's so much more than just social protection and vulnerability programs that we need to transform. And I think the next 10 years have to be this mindset of transformation, particularly related to the economic empowerment agenda or the economic agenda going forward. And we can't do that unless we have really brought all of this together within the household. So thanks to IFPRI for doing really wonderful work, for influencing me, but also I think for influencing big institutions. And I think you have a huge role to play going forward.